Now, in the New Gods, the core of that story was that a father will never hurt his own son.
Mm-hmm.
Now, here I have Darkseid, the most evil character ever created. I can tell you, he was the epitome of all evil. All this fellow wanted to do was own everybody's mind and completely run the universe by himself. And you can't get more affectatious than that. But he couldn't control his own son. And of course his own son became his worst enemy. And there was nothing he could do about it. He was continually frustrated. And if you look through the books, you'll find that Darkseid, although his son is one of his worst enemies, and they have the fiercest of confrontations, that these confrontations will kind of destabilize. The situation would come to stabilize, and the father and son will somehow find themselves in other situations in which this confrontation vanishes. And Darkseid will suddenly find himself in some other situation where he can feel free to do his deviltry. And of course Orion will try to stop him. Orion is his son. And that's one of the truths that I always knew existed. A father will never hurt his own son. And so that was the core of the New Gods. And of course it worked. It was true. I did it in the Losers. Those are war stories. And I do a story with a white tape. And if you walk on one side of the white tape, you'll be fine. If you walk on the other side of the white tape, you'll blow up, because it's a minefield.
As well as the core of truth that goes through your work, one thing that set it apart from most of what was being done then was that there was also a sense of the tragic as well as the heroic that ran through them. Ben Grimm in the Fantastic Four was
Yes.
caught and tormented in his body. Spider-Man, the loss of his Uncle Ben, and Captain America's loss of Bucky. Certainly all through the work, there was that balance, which gave, I think, maturity to the comics.
Well, those are experiences that we've all been familiar with. We've all lost an uncle. We've all lost relatives. We lose friends. We move away from places that were completely familiar to us, and we suddenly find ourselves in different situations, not knowing what confronts us, trying to feel our way out, so we can make wherever we are livable for ourselves, so we can function wherever fate places us. And that's what and that was the core of truth in my most fantastic situations. How do you deal with these places? How do you fight 16 guys? And how would you outwit a monster from Mars? Say, suppose the monster from Mars might be look like an ordinary crocodile. You'd have a human brain. He can outwit you.
Not we elected him president, unfortunately.
What's that?
We elected him president, unfortunately.
Well, I imagine, the United States is big enough to have a lot of different opinions on that.
What's the other way around, man, with the crocodile's brain? One or the other?
Yes. Well, at any rate, what I did, my formula was simple. I just took far-out situations and gave them human conclusions.
You mentioned earlier that you always believed when you were growing up that what you wanted to do, what you were drawn to do, you could do
Yes.
and become.
Yes.
Was that a more optimistic time than now?
No, it was less optimistic, but very turbulent.
Okay.
How would a little unknown like Adolf Hitler suddenly rise to power. He came from nowhere. He was a nothing. In fact, he wasn't even a lieutenant. In fact, he lost the title of lieutenant.
Mm-hmm.
And he wasn't even worthy of that title. And yet he rose from all these masses of people just to make sidewalk speeches.
Mm-hmm.
And somehow he fascinated them. And of course the story of Hitler is familiar to, sadly, it's familiar to the entire world.
Mm-hmm.
And yet there he was, a man intent on, a driven man, being intent on running things, on having his say, and suddenly finding that the entire world is giving way. See?
Mm-hmm.
And he suddenly got everything from Norway to Spain, and from Spain to India. And he took Greece flattened out in a day, you know. And so here was this little man who had conquered all of Europe
Mm-hmm.
by himself. And he had done this just by swaying people. And so I believe that human beings, if they concentrate on what they really want to do, can accomplish what they want to do. But you've really got to want it bad enough to see it to fruition. Mm-hmm. And if you have that urge will materialize. It will materialize in many ways. Perhaps like your station here will someday be a grandiose network, and I'll be your leading fan, I assure you.
That's science fiction.
That's science fiction.
That's science fiction. Well, how did you conquer New York? How did you bring yourself to fruition? What was when you first knew this is what you wanted? Where'd you go? What'd you do? Did you knock on doors?
No.
Send artwork out?
No, I didn't. I simply left where I was. I didn't like my block. I didn't like the block next to it. I didn't like the block next to that one. And so I began to walk. I began to walk uptown, where the office buildings were. There were no brick buildings. There were no fire escapes. My mother once wanted to give me a vacation, so she put me on a fire escape for 2 weeks. And I was out in the open air sleeping for 2 weeks on a fire escape and having a grand time, I assure you. And of course, that kind of thing sooner or later disappointed me. I felt a lot of people liked the block. A lot of people are still there. But I was not content with that kind of environment. I can't tell you why, but I wasn't. And I began to walk. And I found myself on 42nd Street. I found myself on 57th Street. And there was one time I met the champion of the world on 57th Street. Jack Dempsey came out of a hotel.
Mm.
And here he was. And I was working at Marvel at that time, and I was taking some strips to Marvel.
Mm-hmm.
And Jack Dempsey was coming out of this hotel, and I love prize fighters, and I ran over to greet him, and we had a wonderful time. I met Mickey Walker, who was the lightweight champion of the world. Every time I went to Broadway, I met a different champion, it seemed. And Mickey Walker was also an artist, and he had artwork. And he took me to lunch, and we each exchanged artwork, you know, and showed each other our artwork, and we had a wonderful time. So I can't account for meeting all these fighters, but going uptown was quite an experience for me.
One of the first comics you worked on was Blue Beetle.
Yes.
How did you get that gig? How did that come about?
Well, the Blue Beetle was, well, the first people I worked for was the Fleischer brothers, who made Betty Boop. Betty Boop was a fine animation strip, and extremely popular. So wherever I went, I always got a job. I can't tell you why, but I did. And I got this job at the Fleischer Brothers, and they sat me down on a table, and at this long table, there were about 6 or 7 people. And the guy at the end of the table would make 3 drawings and pass it down to the next guy, who would make 3 more. And then he would pass it down to the guy next to him, who would put the checkers in a suit. And then he would pass it down to me, and I would have to put the cuffs on and the spats, maybe. And this went on all day, until the figure took a full step. It was animation. It was a method of turning out animated movies. And they looked great in a movie.
Oh, yeah.
But to me, it was a factory. And here I was doing the things my father was. My father worked in a garment factory. Here I was working in a drawing factory. And I was at Fleischer's about 2.5 weeks before I walked out. I walked out without saying a word. And I never looked back. It wasn't what I wanted to do.
Mm-hmm.
And so I went to a place called the Lincoln Newspaper Features Syndicate. And I did a strip called, it was a panel strip, and it was called Your Health Comes First. And of course my name was Jack Curtis on that one. And it was a literary license, I assure you. And I took things from a medical book, and I would illustrate them in this one panel, which went out to about 350 newspapers. They were weekly papers throughout the United States. And I continued that for a while, but that's not what I wanted. And I began to know that. Mm-hmm. I began to know that the salary wasn't my object. My object was to stay happy. And this kind of thing wasn't making me happy. And the boss gave me to do editorial cartoons. He says, why don't you do these editorial cartoons? I said, well, I'll give them a try. So one day he calls me in. I'd handed him an editorial cartoon. And there was about, it showed Neville Chamberlain patting a huge boa constrictor on the head. And the boa constrictor was Hitler. Mm-hmm. And this had been the conference that took place between Neville Chamberlain and Adolf Hitler.
The appeasement.
The appeasement. And my boss said, how dare you make a political cartoon like that? He says, how do you know about Neville Chamberlain? He says, and this guy Hitler. I says, well, I don't have to know a gangster when I see one,
You were right.
It was an opinion. And I felt Hitler was a gangster because he was grabbing everything in sight, which is what they did on my block.